I'm just gonna say a couple of these because you have an impressive list. So he's received the NIH Director's Innovator Award, got a Kingsley Diamond Scholarship, the Knight Scholar Award, a Sloan Fellowship, the Searle Scholars, and a Burroughs Wellcome Cassie Award. So quite the list, and I think it's very well deserved recognition. So that's kind of like the awards, and you're going to hear about a lot of impressive work. I just wanted to mention kind of some personal connections here, which is just that I don't think there have been many papers or many lines of work that have really influenced my own personal thinking much as Mark.
Oh, thank you.
It took me probably like 5 reads to understand the 2012 paper, your Nature paper. So once I got it, that definitely changed. Obviously my own research, and I think a lot of the field has really been shaped kind of like these new directions we have in motor control. I think come from a lot of foundational work that did and continues to put out great stuff with tangling and divergence and some awesome stuff you'll hear today. So I'm personally very thrilled to have you here. Let's welcome Mark.
Oh. Thank you, Jason. It is, partly it's just really nice to be able to come see some familiar faces, some people that I want to talk to you about science with. But I'm also was really appreciative for the invitation to do stuff that I really have been wanting to talk about for a while. And this is my first sort of chance to do so. And so I spent the last week, trying to put together what I hope will be an edifying talk. And I'm excited for the chance to give it to you guys. And we can roughly up afterwards if it all goes off the rails. So there's a lot of people that contributed to this talk. It's going to be a pretty sort of far-ranging talk. I'm just going to give sort of a particular shout out to this fellow here, Brian, with the slide, and with Larry Abbott, really shaped a lot of. So a lot of what you're going to see conceptually came from this collaboration with Larry and Brian. But there were a lot of people whose work was pretty essential here. Abby came up with some of the sort of key concepts in early analyses. Sean was really critical in devising the decoding technique that I'm going to talk about. And then you'll see some of Andrew's work. But you'll see everybody's work is going to appear at some point or another in this talk. And they're not just people from my lab. They span multiple labs. So the main interest of my lab is understanding the neural control of movement. That's a pretty broad topic. So we trained monkeys to perform a broad range of tasks. I'll just give you sort of a quick idea of what that looks like. So here's a monkey performing a sequential reaching task where he has to quickly reach for 2 targets in a row. Here's a monkey performing a task that Nausea invented. We call this the Pac-Man task. And then the Pac-Man task, the monkey presses on a force sensor. That's a motor neuron that you're hearing. That's a part of the motor. Presses on a force sensor in order to eat the dots. You can see it's pretty good at it. This is our cycling task, which is developed largely by Abby. Monkey cycles through a virtual environment. They do this we have a variety of variants of this. In this case, he's moving between stationary spots where if he stops on those, he knows that he will receive juice. And in fact, you can hear him slurping when he stops. Now he's pedaling back. So we also have a prosthetic version only of the cycling task. So on the left, you're going to hear a lot of slurping because he's now slurping in both movies. In the left, his movement through the virtual world is driven by his arm. And on the right, he thinks it's still driven by his arm, but we completely disconnected the pedal from the system. And all motions in the virtual world is driven by our decode of his brain. So as you might guess, we're interested in neural activity and ideally recording as spikes from as many neurons as possible. So this is a neuropixel probe recording lasting about 100 milliseconds. And there's a neuron here that sort of spikes repeatedly. I'll point it out by using the sort of standard format in the field, which is little tick marks every time there's an identified spike. And you'll see that format throughout the rest of the talk. Most of you are probably already familiar with it. So in this situation, each line is one neuron, and each tick is when the neuron chose to emit a spike. The black line is the actual angular velocity of the monkey as he pedals, and the green line is our offline but in real-time decode of that velocity. And you can see that we are inferring from the neural activity very accurately what the animal is trying to do at every moment, with very few errors and very little lag. And the reason we're able to do that is by exploiting a structure that neural activity has, that I'm illustrating here on the left. And don't expect to understand this yet. It's sort of the main point of the talk. But you can see that neural activity is sort of rolling around on these rails. It sort of look like you can almost sort of think of them as roller coaster tracks. And our job is trying to figure out where neural activity is at any given moment in this sort of abstracted space. And the fact that we're able to successfully decode behavior indicates that this is indeed working and has something to do with the job of this network in producing it. But of course, what you're seeing on the left doesn't look at all like spikes, right? You can understand what a spike is. The thing on the left looks kind of weird, right? It's a ball moving around in an abstracted space. So what is this abstraction? Should we trust it? What does it mean? What's the connection to this? So that's going to be the first third of the talk, which is really going to be, roughly speaking, the first half of the talk. And it's going to be a little conceptual and didactic, but Jason knows I like being didactic. So why use an abstraction? Why not just talk about spikes and neurons? I mean, we all know what those things are. And the answer is that abstractions are sometimes just scientifically necessary if you're trying to understand mechanism. And I'm going to illustrate that by starting with a case where it is not true. So this is the monosynaptic reflex. It's very easy to understand just in terms of the activity of a sensory neuron, how it communicates with a neuron within the spinal cord, and then causes the muscle to contract in response, right? And we can understand this mechanistically because we can trace the flow of causality through the system. And we do not need any abstraction. Or more correctly, we do not need any abstraction other than the ones we already have and are comfortable with. Okay? So here's another example where that's also true. Please do not try and work through the details of this. Some of you will recognize this as the neural network that first proved that neural networks can actually do interesting nonlinear things and brought neural networks back from the grave. It solves the exclusive OR problem, which is a nonlinear problem. And I promise you that if you put effort into it, you can trace the flow of signals through this simple feed-forward network and figure out how it works. It's not terribly fun nor terribly rewarding, but you can certainly do it, and it's worth doing once. However, in a large recurrently connected network that does something interesting, for example, maybe converts this static command that you can sort of think of as a command for time to move now into an interesting pattern of activity, which you might think of as the command for the activity of a particular muscle. This breaks down, and we simply cannot follow the flow of causality spike by spike or neuron by neuron. So causality flows through the network in the usual way that we're all used to, but it also rattles around inside the network, right? In ways that basically make it impossible to trace this out spike by spike and neuron by neuron in the way that you might want. Things get even worse if you look empirically. So this might be the spike train of the network when this is actually a real spike train, but pretend it's from the simulated network. When it's performing the task once, it's going to then perform the task, the exact same computation a second time, and we're going to get a different pattern of spikes. Now, they're clearly related, but they're also clearly different, right? There's these moments where, there's a spike here, there's no corresponding spike there, there's two extra spikes there. So if we tried, even if we succeeded in following the causal flow of every spike, well, that's not going to then work on the next try. So we need some kind of abstraction that can tell us what these two spike trains have in common, because they don't actually share the times of any individual. And fortunately, in science, we're very used to abstraction. We accept it. We're okay with it. Here's an abstraction that's a little closer to heart, to home. So what the expression is, if you're a neuroscientist, the openings and closings seemingly stochastically of many channels of a particular type, maybe a potassium channel, you feel perfectly comfortable summarizing that as with a single number that is conductance, right? And you might accept it's a teeny bit noisy because it's really the average, openingness of all of these individual channels, but you're okay with that abstraction. And indeed, that abstraction is utterly essential to understanding very simple things like the action potential. So, for example, the sodium conductance tells you about the state of the sodium, this is the potassium conductance. You then need two numbers actually to describe the state of the sodium channels. Those in turn determine the membrane voltage, which wraps back around and determines whether or not those channels are open or closed. So we do not need to go through these equations, but we all get the basic idea that we can follow causality around this loop, with the voltage influencing the channels and the channels influencing the voltage, and that is indeed a good way of understanding the action. And if we like, and people do, we can even summarize our knowledge in one of these handy-dandy state spaces, where we plot, back to the normal pointer, where we plot the potassium conductance on one axis and the voltage on another axis, and then the action potential is now a trajectory through the state space. And we can reduce all of these annoying equations that none of us really want to, again, understand more than once, down to a set of arrows in the state space that guide that trajectory, right? So causality is now a bunch of green arrows in state space. And I want you to remember that for the rest of the talk. Causality is perfectly fine if it's green arrows in state space, right? And in fact, it's a lot easier than understanding those individual equations. And in fact, in situations where you might not even have equations, because everything's some crazy nonlinear approximation, the arrows will still be your friend. Oh, one last thing I should have pointed out. That's a two-dimensional state space, right? It really should have been four. I mean, in a sense, it should have been many thousands, one for every individual channel, but we're okay with abstraction, so it should have been at least four. We can only see two, which is not really enough, but two can still often be useful, as it was indeed in that. So the idea of describing neural activity in state spaces is reasonably old. It's, of course, much older in the physical sciences. But people were doing this in the context of artificial networks by the late 80s and early 90s. By the early 2000s, people were using it as a visualization tool for looking at activity in ways where it would have been hard to see the things in just standard plots versus time. And then we were also starting to use it as a way of couching and creating and generating hypotheses that would have been difficult to cleanly express in other ways. And then, as you'll see on the bottom here, of actually plotting the data in the same format in a way that allowed us to test those hypotheses. What you see here is neural activity on a bunch of trials becoming more consistent over time as the monkey prepares a specific pending accurately. So at this point, it is common in systems neuroscience to plot data in these formats. And in fact, often one picks very carefully the state space that one uses, and in fact does so in order to be able to compare trajectories between, say, neural data and trajectories of models that are essentially hypotheses for how you think the system works mechanistically, right? And this is now probably the most widely used abstraction in systems neuroscience, or at least the most widely used novel abstraction, right? And somebody that you might know is well known for creating a method that allows one to accurately infer these trajectories even on single trials. There's actually a lot of such methods. It just happens to be that this is probably the best one. But this sort of raises the question, well, and I assure you that this is not a rhetorical question, right? People legitimately feel this way. Is this a real abstraction? Does it really get at mechanism? What the heck does this really mean anyway? What does this have to do with any of the things that I'm comfy with, like neurons and spikes? Okay? And something I've done, but I should have pointed it out, but now's as good a time as any, is people put many names on these axes that often simply reflect the method that they use, like PCA or factor analysis or whatever. I'm going to always refer to these state spaces as capturing the evolution of factors. What factor 1 does, what factor 2 does, what factor 3 does. So what are factors, right? Why should we care about them? Do they really have anything to do with mechanism? Are we just playing games in state space, right? Or does this abstraction really get at the mechanism of computation? Okay. So one issue here, and here we can go from loving Chaitin to trashing him, is that currently factors are defined statistically, right? Because what everybody wanted is a way of guessing what the factors are as accurately as possible given their data, right? And so people like Chaitin make good statistical assumptions, and they leverage those as best they can in order to estimate the factors from the seemingly noisy neural spikes, which is an entirely legitimate thing to do, and we're going to get back to doing that later. But if you're trying to understand what this means mechanistically, this is not helpful. Okay, so let's roll through what the statistical models are. The claim is that there's something called a latent factor that we can't see and hides in the ether, and it tells real physical neurons what to do. And indeed, it endows them with something called an underlying rate. Okay? Now, this is already problematic. I can assure you that even though this is a very old concept in systems neuroscience, it's very poorly grounded. There's nothing inside a neuron that's easily defined that corresponds to an underlying rate. It certainly is not the membrane voltage. Okay? And then, even more problematically, supposedly that underlying rate determines probabilistically when individual spikes occur, right? Such that if rate is high, well, you might spike, you might not. Who knows? You're more likely to spike. You just flip a coin. So this, while a very good statistical model, one I've employed myself in more rudimentary form, is very problematic if you're trying to understand things mechanistically, right? What we really want to do is turn things around. And if factors are a real abstraction, we should be able to understand what they are in terms of spikes. And if they're important to the mechanistic flow by which the network performs its computation, we ought to be able to complete this. Okay? So what I'm going to tell you in the first half of this talk, halfway over at this point, is that for a large class of spiking networks, you need these factors. This is not for all spiking networks, but for a large class of spiking networks, factors are the only good way by which a human can understand the computational mechanism of thought. I mean, if you're God and you have infinite working memory, you can follow every darn spike around. We can't. We need this abstraction. So if we're going to get mechanistic, let's come up with a mechanistic model of an individual neuron, not statistical. So this is the simplest mechanistic model you can come up with, more or less, or at least the simplest good one. A neuron sums up its inputs with weights that correspond to synaptic strengths, right? When it crosses a threshold, it will fire an action potential, right? And so it's some sort of leaky integrator of those inputs, and when it crosses threshold, fires an action potential and resets, right? So activity is very discrete. Either a 1, it spikes, or it's a 0, it didn't. It's mostly zeros. Most neurons don't spike most of the time. And the output is some simple, though highly nonlinear function of the inputs, right? This is not what we need to perform a computation. We all know that. We know that we're going to have to put this neuron inside a network, and that larger network is going to perform the computation, okay? So I'm going to assume that I'm still okay from a miking standpoint. So there has been considerable work on how to do this with spiking networks, where it's a lot harder than with networks that sort of assume what you want to prove, which is that there's something called a factor or an underlying firing rate and are continuously valued, right? We don't want that, right? We want to trace this down to actual spiking networks. So there's been a lot of very good prior art on this, okay? And we're going to steal heavily from that, but we're going to add, and this is really where Brian and Larry came in, and me a little bit, a training method that's considerably more powerful. You could train these networks to do a much broader range of things, which for the moment, for this talk, we don't really care about. What we do care about is it's more powerful because it makes explicit the centrality of factors to the mechanistic computation performed by the network. Okay? So let's run through that. I'm going to present this in cartoon format, but remember, these are real simulations running in real computers, and we'll get back to that at the end. But I'm going to present it in somewhat cartoon form. So we're going to give our network some random connectivity, right? So this is the connectivity matrix. It's going to be roughly equally balanced between excitation and inhibition. We've known for a very long time that in networks of that type, they will spike, and they will spike quite randomly and stochastically. They certainly don't compute anything. They don't do anything interesting. They just sit there and burble away and produce random spikes. So concentrate on the upper right-hand corner because we're going to train this network. That means that we're going to adjust those weights. So look at that matrix, and it will change. Okay? So we made some change to make the network do some specific computation that we don't need to worry about that. So let's pull that change down. Okay, this is the important part of the connectivity in a sense, because it's the part that allowed it to actually perform its computation. And we're going to break it into the product of two matrices. Okay, you kind of have to trust me that this is the right thing to do, but it sort of seems reasonable, right? Like, I mean, if this is a million neuron network, that's a million squared connections. We need to be able to describe the important change in terms of many fewer numbers, right? And if you do this decomposition, you can get away with many fewer. So this is going to be the important part of the change in the connectivity in the network that allows it to actually perform the computation. Okay. So, well, what does this mean? This is still just matrices, right? So what is an n by 2 matrix, right? Well, it's just something that takes you from n numbers linearly down to two things, right? So from n neurons to two things. Okay, so that's great. Well, how do we get back to our n neurons? Well, that's of course what this is for. This takes you from two things back to n neurons, right? So, well, what are those things? It will not surprise you at this point that I'm going to call them factors, right? So each factor is a linearly weighted sum of the activity of all the neurons with a very specific set of weights that then speaks back to all of the neurons and transmits its activity back to all of them. So if you make appropriate changes in those weights, i.e. the weights that impact the factors and also impact how the factors impact the neurons, the network will now finally do something interesting, and you will have patterned activity in your network, appropriate for whatever task it was that you trained it on. Now, it will still be true that the spikes are pretty darn random. They'll look roughly Poisson, and the activity of individual neurons will often seem inscrutable. You don't care. And the reason you don't care is because the factors are well behaved. Each factor is a weighted sum of the spikes of the individual neurons. And although the neurons emit different spikes, a completely different pattern of spikes every time the network does the computation, that's not true of the factors. The factors will do nearly the same thing every time the network does nearly the same thing. And so the factors are well behaved and interpretable in a way that the individual spikes are not. So we're all very used to following causality sort of through connections between neurons. But remembering that now the important part, the task relevant part of the causality, all flows through these factors, right? And because causality is a loop, it doesn't matter where we start the loop. I mean, who knows where a circle starts, right? So we might as well focus our attention over here on the factors. And we will take a factor-centric view of the world, at least for now. We can shift our attention back to the neurons later if we like. And so now we can think of the factors as influencing their own future state via that population of neurons. Okay, why is this useful? That's useful because now we can summarize the entire system with a small number of numbers, just the values of each of the two factors. And we can think of causality, much as we did with the action potential, in this lower dimensional space, where these green arrows describe the flow of causality. Okay, so how does all of this work? It works because neural networks are function approximators, right? So what is a neural network? It takes its input, it transforms it in some way that approximates some function, and it produces an output. So that means that as causality flows around this way, right, the future state of the factors is some function of the present state, where it's the neuron's job to instantiate that function, whatever it is. And that will then cause some change in the factor-based state. And if, for example, an annoying experimenter optogenetically perturbs the neural states, it's that the factors are somewhere else, right? Causality will flow through in the usual way and correct it. So now instead of thinking of causality at this annoying level of gajillions of individual spikes and synapses, we can think of it as these green arrows in this reduced dimensional space. And that's a heck of a lot easier, at least if you're me. So that hopefully answers the question of what is the proposed abstraction. Whether or not you should trust it, I guess, is still kind of coming up. The proof of the eating will be in the pudding. But I want to briefly address this question of, are these factors real? Right? I don't know. Is pressure real? Temperature? Not as real as like actual atoms bouncing around, right? But it's sort of real enough to get the job done. So I'm not going to tell you whether it's real or not. This is a personal decision. Every one of you makes for themselves. The answer could be different in the morning versus the afternoon. But what I can tell you, if it makes you feel better, think of the following. These factors live nowhere in the brain, right? No, there's no physical instantiation, but there could be. So I'm going to be a slightly different God from our present God, and I'm going to build the brain differently. I'm going to have all learning and all interest in causality flow through magical analog glia. All right, these will be real cells, and they're analog valued activity. They don't spike, and all they do is that they sum up their inputs. That produces an analog activity value, and they kick that back to the neurons. That'd be incredibly useful if nature had built the system that way, because then we could just record from the analog glia, and we would be able to see all of, we wouldn't need Chaitin anymore, right? We would be able to see all of causality flowing before us, right? So obviously the factors are not as real as they would be in that situation, but that situation would be mathematically identical and mechanistically identical to the one that I'm telling you, right? The way in which the system would work and the way in which we should understand how it works would be exactly the same. So now that causality is green arrows, well, now we can quickly realize how we might create a very broad variety of different computations. So many of you are probably familiar with the classic sort of Newsom, Shadlin, Mobshin dots task, where monkeys or people have to decide whether randomly moving dots are on average moving to the right versus the left. Some sort of integrator is known to be the right way to solve that task, unsurprisingly, right? And it's very easy to build a line attractor out of a system like this, and then to have something at the end that will capture you and pull you in some direction once you've accumulated enough evidence that you're reasonably sure. It's very easy to then create fancier versions of this, as this is an idea from Paul Chiswick's lab, where now it's basically the same thing, except activity flows upwards, which means that sooner or later you will be forced to make a decision one way or another, right? And you can imagine any way in which you want to tweak this. You can introduce biases, whatever you want. You just move the arrows around appropriately. It's not hard to understand what to do with the arrows, right? So this doesn't just work as a cartoon. This works in reality. I'll fly through this pretty fast, but this is Brian having actually trained his spiking networks to perform a task that's known to be a difficult and interesting task for both monkeys and neural networks, which is that you have to ignore an irrelevant aspect of the stimulus and then pay attention to a relevant aspect of the stimulus when making your decision. And which aspect is relevant will change on every trial, right? And the network can do this. I'm not going to go through the factor level explanation, but just trust me that that's what you want. Another example is this one here. So Brian's going to train a network to take simplified inputs to tell it what reach it should make. And then when it gets a go cue, it's going to reach in one of 8 different directions. What do I mean, reach? How does the network doesn't have an arm? All I really need is it's trained to produce the real muscle activity that I really recorded from the real arm, right? And the network does this. So it happily produces patterns of muscle activity that look like the real activity. They're a little noisy because it's being generated by a noisy spiking network, but it certainly gets the job done. And when we look at, say, the response of an individual neuron in this network, here it is. These are the spike trains across multiple trials. So now this isn't multiple neurons, it's multiple trials for the same neuron. So you can see what I was talking about before, right? The spikes are different on every single trial. And then there's a different pattern of activity for each direction as it's being prepared and then executed. And Chaitin will confirm, perhaps even vocally and with enthusiasm, that if you were to record a neuron that looked like this from motor cortex, you would be not the least bit surprised. That looks exactly like the response of a cortical neuron. So, we spent a long time worrying about, well, mechanistically, like, what are these seemingly random spikes and weird tuning properties of these neurons? Like, well, in this situation, we actually know, right? Like, we have a mechanistic model. It really does produce patterns of muscle activity as an output. And I'll give at least a partial explanation later for what's actually going on here at the causal level, but I'm going to skip over that now. So, if the proof of the pudding's in, other than I thought. So let's try to address an old scientific question and see whether or not this new framework helps, right? And the question is, how do we produce sort of rapid, accurate sequences? And this is a very old question. And the idea for a long time has been that you learn to take multiple movements and through practice, turn them into one very rapid, holistic movement, right? So that your bank code is, your PIN is no longer 4 independent movements. It's now one movement where 4 movements used to be, right? And that this occurs through continuous and excessive practice, and that in fact, it's necessary for this to occur, because once it has occurred, you can execute that sequence much more rapidly and more accurately than you could have if you had to ploddingly do each thing on its own, okay? But there's very little, nobody knows what the neural basis of this might be. Nobody knows if this is really true. It just seems like a good idea based on behavioral data and introspection. So we train monkeys, as you saw earlier, to execute rapid sequences of 2 reaches. This is the monkey during training. He actually gets a little faster than this. There's 100 milliseconds when he lands on the first target before he goes to the next target, right? So 1/10 of a second. So he's doing this really fast. And consistent, same monkey, he's in retirement. He can like this. He looks very fluffy because it's a little cold sometimes in Texas. So during a reach like that, or a set of pair of reaches like this, the muscle activity that comes out is continuous, right? You cannot, if you look at the muscle activity, you're not like, oh yeah, there's 2 reaches there. It's this one continuous outflow. And so that's certainly consistent with this hypothesis, but of course we really want to look inside the brain. And there we're going to leverage something that, we've built up a lot of knowledge over the last decade, 2 decades, really actually more than that, about what goes on before and during single reaches. Okay, so it's been known since at least the 70s that before a rapid movement, there's preparatory activity. So that's activity in the brain that occurs in the absence of any movement. We now know that that activity is essential. It's always there. You will always prepare a movement before you execute it, and you need to. Okay? But it doesn't generate the movement yet. You have to wait for a signal that we're going to call the trigger signal. This is more recently discovered. We found it in monkeys, and it is very tightly locked to the moment of movement onset and very predictive of it. And it's since been shown in some very beautiful experiments from Carl Svoboda's lab. It's there in mice as well, and you can manipulate it to either produce or inhibit the triggering of a movement, right? So we've got a good handle on that, and we're feeling pretty good about life. And then, of course, there's also execution-related activity during the movement, which, for this talk at least, we're going to mostly ignore. So because we know those things, we can not only formulate 2 nice hypotheses, but we can tell you what their predictions are. So in a holistic strategy, there should be one preparatory period, because once you practice, the hell out of whatever the sequence is, it's executed as a single holistic whole. And of course, you should then be launched by one trigger signal, right? Whereas under the independent strategy, you would be stuck having 2 preparatory periods. You've got to prepare, do, and then re-prepare the next movement. And of course, you would then need 2 triggers. And of course, our hypothesis is that monkeys would start this way and then with practice transition to the holistic strategy as they became very fast. As I will tell you, that is not true. The brain continues to use the independent strategy. It just gets really good at preparing the next movement while the present one is presently still unfolding. Okay? So how are we able to figure that out? We would have been completely up some creek if all we had been able to do was look at the activity of individual neurons. Spikes would be hopeless, but even the average firing rates, this is the average firing rate of one neuron across a bunch of different conditions. And you can definitely see that once the targets turn on, there's a lot of preparatory activity before the first reach. So yeah, there's clearly preparatory activity. There's clearly execution-related activity. It seems to continue on through to the second reach. But is there any preparation that's occurring between these 2 reaches? That's simply impossible to say, because preparation and execution are mixed up in most neurons. And so how are you going to tell, right? The only reason we know this is preparatory activity is because we know there's no execution occurring at the same time. how are we going to recognize preparatory activity that might overlap with execution? And other neurons aren't going to help us. They're each their own beautiful little snowflake. I should say, you might think this is noisy. These neurons are very consistent. You record this neuron for, another 1,000 trials. It'll do exactly the same thing. It's not noise. It wants to do that. It's just that we don't know what that means. But that's okay. We didn't expect single neurons to make much sense. We expected the factors to make sense, right? We want to follow causality at that level. And in fact, at the moment, we don't even really care about the causality itself. We just care about the factors that are, the fact that factors can be better defined things that get closer to the heart of the mechanism than the individual neurons. And so, for example, we might expect for there to be a factor or indeed multiple factors related to preparation. And indeed, that's true. So if you look during single reaches, you can see that this factor takes on different values depending on what is being prepared. And then the factor totally shuts down as soon as the reach begins, and it stays shut up for the rest of the reach, right? So what, and there are multiple preparatory factors. So really to be careful, we should summarize the size of that envelope across all of them. And that's what I'm doing. So what happens during 2 reaches? Well, there's now 2 bouts of preparatory activity. And you can see that again in the envelope across all of the factors, right? And in fact, the second bout of preparatory activity is starting before the first reach is even ended. So, okay, well, what about the trigger factor? Is there a trigger factor? Well, yes, there is a trigger factor. It has the interesting property that it doesn't care what movement you're going to make. It just cares when you're going to make it. It jumps up very rapidly at a moment that's very tightly locked and very predictive of movement. And it does so twice when you're going to execute a very rapid, highly practiced sequence, right? So you don't actually ever unify these things in a holistic whole. You maintain 2 preparatory periods. It's just that you get really good at preparing the next movement while the present movement's still occurring. There's still 2 trigger signals. And so the independent strategy is used even for very rapid, very highly practiced sequences. And if you think about it, it actually makes sense in retrospect. Kind of be doing yourself a disservice by using the holistic strategy because you cannot rearrange those elements, right? Whereas if you get very good at the independent strategy, you can very quickly learn to perform any new combination of those elements, right? Whereas with a holistic strategy, right, you would be locked in, right? So for example, say you wanted to make a sequence of 4 movements, and there's 10 choices of each movement. Right? You've got 10 to the 4th different possible things you'd have to learn. So unless there's only one sequence you ever care about, it's much better off using this strategy. Oh, thank you for warning me. Yeah, it's funny. Normally it would be fine, but I think between all the movies and driving the HDMI, I'm going to assume that down here somewhere. Okay. But somebody showed the time at me. I can't see it over there. So, yeah. Okay. Oh, yeah. We're fine. Yeah. We'll finish a little early. Okay. So, a long-standing goal of the lab where both Nathan and I got our starts, which was Krishna Shenoy's lab, was to leverage better scientific understanding to build better prosthetic BMI decoding devices in order to eventually help human patients. And that's been a sort of small goal of my lab as well. And I'm going to show you how this sort of factor level view plays into that. So this is a video I took just on my iPhone. You can hear the chatter. Way back in Krishna's lab of a monkey controlling a cursor directly with his brain and doing so pretty accurately. And we would like to be able to do, that's already pretty good, but the better that you can do and the more broadly you can achieve that level of performance, especially under, as you start, for example, losing neurons in your recording device, the more plausible it becomes that this will be able to truly help patients. We already know it can work in human patients, but The greater the robustness, obviously the larger the patient population, that it would make sense to use such devices for. So I'm going to follow you through a sort of a story about, actually relates to the reaching network from earlier, about how causality flows during a task that's similar to the one that we just saw, where the monkey's executing a set of reaches. We're just going to do it for real reaches first, right? So causality flows in a way that I hope we're all kind of familiar with now, and we'll take the factor-centric view. It's going to be helpful. And we will plot, and this is indeed the data from the 2012 paper that Jason mentioned. We will plot that data in a factor space, and we'll plot it for just two conditions. Green is reaching left, and red is reaching right. And you'll see that the neural activity traces these large circles, right? And initially, that seems pretty weird, right? The monkey's not reaching in circles. This is a straight reach, right? But it was actually a prediction of some very early modeling. In fact, before anybody could even really train recurrent network models, sort of Larry and colleagues were able to make guesses about how networks should solve this kind of problem. And this made sense given that prediction. And it made sense because if you think about this other form of causality, which is what really matters to the monkey, right? Which is, how does the activity of the network influence the arm, right? So this is the actual muscle activity that I recorded from the arm when the monkey reaches to the left. This is recorded from the deltoids, those of us in the audience. And I want to rewind. First I want to say that if factor A is the driving factor for this muscle activity, everything is going to make sense, right? Because of course the factors aren't there just to provide causality within the network. They're also there in order to speak to downstream brain areas, or in this case, downstream muscle. Okay. So let's rewind up above and ask ourselves whether this makes sense. So I want you to look at those same swirling trajectories with a new eye. Concentrate only on the vertical axis for the green dot, right? And you'll see that it goes down, and it comes back up, and it goes down, and then it's flat, right? And if you look down at the EMG, that of course is exactly what the EMG did. It went down, it went up, it went down, and it went back up. So this is a good recipe for making the EMG do what it needs to do to make the arm reach left. Okay, well, what about making the arm reach to the right? Well, now you'll notice that the initial state of the system is in a different place, right? In fact, that happened during preparation. So causality is actually going to flow in more or less the same way. And these little arrows that were good to us before are going to keep being good to us. They're going to describe the flow of activity, but we'll get a very different trajectory because we started in a different place. And it'll go high and then low and high again, which interestingly is exactly what the muscle does and what it needs to do in order to make the arm do that. So this is a good sort of factor-based network strategy for producing the kinds of multiphasic patterns of EMG activity that we know that the arm needs. And it's not just present across those two reaches, but across all the different reaches that we trained the monkey to make, which include a variety of straight and curved reaches at different distances. This was readily replicated when David Cicillo trained, this is not a spiking model, this is just a traditional firing rate-based model. To perform this task, it happily produces the real EMG very accurately, and it employs this strategy. Now, I will point out that there was, and maybe, although I'm not sure it exists beyond Twitter anymore, maybe still is some sort of controversy regarding how strongly to interpret these rotational patterns. Right? And it relates to the fact that if you were to take data that sort of went somewhere and came back and plot it in a PC space or some factor space, right, you're going to see some form of a loop, right? But seeing multiple loops of this sort that all go in the same direction with the same angular velocity across all the different conditions is not something that one would sort of expect in random data. And one can formalize that and people have. More important, related, but much more importantly, is what's the range of models that can explain not only this data, but a variety of other features that matter deeply to me about motor cortex activity that I spent a good chunk of my life documenting, but I'm not going to run through in a moment. You know, how large is the space of models that can explain all of that data jointly? And at least so far, the space of models is very small. And they all are of this form. Right, where you have a network, you have some dynamics, and you have dynamics at the level of factors. Now, that's not to say that everybody agrees or hugs at every meeting. There's some interesting disagreement about the nature of this function and therefore the nature of the dynamics. And if you're the sort of person that cares about this kind of detail, and I am, that matters to you. There's also some interesting disagreement over how much of the causality flows through internal circuits, internal to the brain, versus how much of the causal flow might actually be external, right? Because, of course, motor cortex receives huge amounts of sensory feedback. Those are both interesting debates on which the dust has not yet completely settled. I will say that from a prosthetic standpoint, it'd be very unfortunate if all the causality flowed that way. And we pretty much know that it doesn't. I mean, some people have made sort of straw man arguments that it might, but I don't think even they seriously believe it. We know that, for example, the dynamics begin well before the arm begins to move, so the motion of the arm can't be responsible for the dynamics. And maybe most importantly for this talk, we know from Cason's work that even humans with very limited ability to actually move have, meaningful characterizable dynamics in their motor cortex. There's a variety of other reasons, but I will skip those because that's sort of enough to get us started. I will also say that, and this is critical, and it's going to come up again, there's more than just the two dimensions that you see, which kind of makes sense. You can see these things crisscrossing one another, which shouldn't really happen if that were sort of a well-behaved dynamical system, right? And so there's, even in this early simple models, there's more dimensions than just the two we could plot for you, which was, of course, true of the action potential as well. And I would say that the more that we learn, the more we realize that there's more dimensions than we really. Okay, so how is all of this going to help us? Well, the goal, of course, is to identify how the factors behave and how the factors relate to the normal, natural movement of the arm, such that when the arm is lost, you can infer what the arm might be doing from the behavior of the thought. Okay? But here's where we have to stop being mechanistic and we have to return to being statistical. Because we do not get to see all of this. We don't get to see the activity of most neurons, and we certainly don't know what that connectivity is, right? So what we get to see is the activity of a smattering of neurons. And we then have to guess, based on math, the most likely value of the factors, right? So, for example, we might guess the value of the factors that maximize the probability of the observed spikes. And we would be greatly aided in that exercise if we could place some constraints upon what the factors can and can't do. And many people have done that quite successfully. We're going to do it too, but we're going to do it in a slightly different way. So I'm going to tell you how we're not going to do it. We're not going to make the traditional assumptions in this field, which I am embodying with this lawn robot, which is rather like a Roomba. So it roams around your lawn, mows the lawn, as I'm sure you can infer. And it kind of nicely encapsulates the traditional set of assumptions, which is that the factors are pretty low D. There's not very many of them. But you can kind of go anywhere you want within that factor space, right? It doesn't mean you can transport from one end to the other. There's limits on your motion, right? This thing is limited in what it can do. But it can eventually, one way or another, go anywhere in this state space. Okay? But we want to ask ourselves, does that really make sense in this sort of brave new factory world? So let's consider what factors can and can't do, because they're very powerful, but that does not mean they can do anything. So here I've built a cartoon flow field that's going to create the following trajectory that, if you think about it, will create this pattern on the vertical axis, goes up, down, up, down, up, down, up, down as we go around the circle, and this pattern on this axis. So that's great, right? If I wanted to produce these two patterns of muscle activity, this would be a great network, right? You go home and train this network up at home. This is not hard to do these days. So now we're going to say we want a different pattern of activity for the first factor, because maybe there's some muscle that goes in double time, which actually does happen. Now we have a problem because our trajectory through state space is now, I very carefully picked this such that this will be a figure 8, right? Which means that we cross in the middle. Why is this a problem? This is a problem because what does it mean to be in the middle? It means that you have a very particular factor state, right? Which means that causality is supposed to then cause you to have the next factor state, right? On the next time step. But how can that, you can't have the same state at the two different future states. That violates the very definition of a function. So that means that you can never have a factor-based trajectory that does that, at least not in 2 dimensions. And so we're going to call this pesky little point in the middle a tangle point. And the claim is going to be that when a network is operating in this factor-based mode and is doing things sort of internally of its own accord, it should never, ever, ever do that. It shouldn't even come close to doing that. And indeed, it's actually very easy to avoid tangling. So for example, if you did want to produce that figure 8, well, that's not a problem. You just need to add yourself an extra dimension. But notice that now what's going on inside in order to create this, say, figure 8 as what you're sending to the muscles or some other brain area, right? Now can look pretty different from the output, right? So this is part of why we think when we look inside motor cortex, its activity looks so different from muscle activity. And I want you to note that the following features that we expect neural activity to have. Big circular trajectories, because that's a great way of keeping tangling low, right? And I will state without proof that even a little bit of tangling is bad. Even if you come close, that creates a lack of noise robustness in the network. You want tangling to be as low as possible, to be as noise robust. We expect extra factors. We needed 1 here, but in other circumstances, we might need more. So we expect more factors than outputs, perhaps a lot of them. And we expect highly directional flow along. You cannot decide to go backwards, right? Those green arrows tell you where to go, and that's where you're going, right? So the first prediction of this is that during a rhythmic movement, the dominant structure, not all the structure, but the dominant structure of motor cortex activity should be a big circle that maintains a consistent pole in the middle. And that should be true regardless of what the muscles are doing. I will show you that that's true. The muscles do sometimes take on that figure 8 form, but the neural trajectories, sorry, I don't think I stated this. This is what, although you probably could have inferred it, this is a monkey cycling at a range of speeds. So you just saw one trajectory for each of those speeds. Okay. So this presence of low tangling is consistently observed across a wide variety of tasks, not just the ones I'm showing you here. But I'm going to show you another example from cycling at different speeds just for didactic purposes. So this is now with the monkey cycling backwards at different speeds. And again, you see these big circular trajectories. Now I'm letting the trajectories pile on top of one another. And what it shows you is that the muscle trajectories are like the lawn robot, right? They fill up all of space, right? Any possible muscle state is possible and achievable. But that is not true at the level of the neurons, right? Now, it's not the case that each one of those neural trajectories is the same. They are separated from one another. They look like a stack of pancakes. And that separation is critical because otherwise you'd be flowing in the same way, but at different speeds, which would just be another form of tangling. Also wouldn't be allowed. So I want you to consider this idea that trajectories need to remain separate from one another. They can't cross one another. They can't even come close to crossing one another as just almost sacrosanct when it comes to this motor area, right? And so when you see something like this where it looks like things are crossing, if you look in enough dimensions, they absolutely are not. They're not even coming close. They're staying away from being tangled as if they're like the pencil. And even for, this is probably the most complex trajectory you've ever seen in motor cortex. This is during the Pac-Man task across a wide variety of different force profiles. It looks like spaghetti in 2 dimensions. If you were to allow this to expand into the 20-ish dimensions it really occupies, you would see that none of these trajectories ever come close to one another. They stay far, far apart. So we need to move away from the long robot, and the best I could come up with as an analogy is this one here. Although you'll have to imagine it in many more dimensions than just 3, right? But first of all, there's many places in state space you simply cannot go. You don't want to find yourself here. So most of state space is a hole. It's a place you can't go. In enough dimensions, that's like 99.9999999% of the states are places you can't go and will never go and don't want to ever go, right? There may be moments of indecision where you're sort of not sure which track you're going to get on and which movement you're going to make. But once you've made your choice, right, your future is pretty strongly determined for at least a while, and you know where you'll be going next. So we can leverage this assumption to decode, and that's exactly what we're doing here. So this is sort of our high-dimensional water park of a roller coaster ride. And we're going to leverage the fact that although the data is very high-dimensional, very small number of states are actually visitable. which means that we can check every single one of them. So we can go to this state here and say, how likely is it that the spikes came from this state? And we're really aided by the fact that if we know we're here now, well, we must have been here during the last 3 time steps. So we can even leverage the history of the spikes. We can say how likely it was that I observed the spikes over the last quarter of a second, given that I'm here now. And then we can simply march forward. So we can compute the probability of the spikes for that possible set of factors. And then we'll just march around. We'll march all the way around, and we'll continuously recompute the probability of the spikes given the factors. And then we'll just pick whichever one is the most likely. And there's a few thousand states to check, but who cares? Computers are fast. And it's a lot less. I mean, you would be in the, you'd have like 10 to the 20th states if you didn't do it this way. So, a few thousand states is nothing. And by doing so, at every time step, we can now estimate where we think you are on this sort of high-dimensional roller coaster ride. And the proof that we're doing a reasonable job of guessing is the fact that we're doing a very good job of accurately decoding the data. Right? It doesn't just work for cycling. Here it is during a reaching task. This is all offline performance, but it is done in real time. So you're only allowed to look at spikes from the past. You're not allowed to look into the future. We could do one other trick, which I'll roll through really fast in order to make this work a little bit better, which is that we could say, well, if this is a likely state and this is a likely state, and this is a likely state given that trailing history, then maybe this is actually the most likely state, and you can use math in order to figure out whether or not that's true, and then you simply pick the most likely state, and you happily interpolate between 2 nearby trajectories. And then you would, of course, interpolate between the corresponding physical trajectories. And as long as those things are close, right, that linear interpolation will be used. So I want you to think of this as sort of a mesh on which the neural state can live in a very high-dimensional space. There's a lot of places you can go, but most places are inaccessible to you. In fact, the vast majority of places are accessible to you. And it's the fact that we can ignore the inaccessible places that allows us to do very well with very little, right? It's kind of like the theme of my life, really. And so, but before pointing that out, I'm going to point out how well you would do if you decided factors are ridiculous. I like my spikes. Screw you and your abstraction. I'm sticking with what I know. I'm just going to filter my spikes, right? And I'm going to then just linearly decode based on filtered firing rates, right? You'd be doing really bad, right? You'd be doing good. So I haven't said this, but half of you, well, I don't know, 20% of you have probably inferred. This is from Chaitin's recent competition where we're just replotting the data. Okay. On the other hand, if you're willing to use something like Chaitin's auto-LFADS method, which does make the assumption that in fact, pretty much most of these methods make the assumption that there's something called a factor and that we should decode based upon that factor, you actually do very well. And ours is simply a different way of doing that, and you also do very well. And now this is just a one-dimensional metric of success. The reason why you would use MINT or LFADS wouldn't really be because of who's doing slightly better or worse here. It would be based on the particular situation that you cared about in the moment. The larger point here isn't really about exact performance. It's that all of the methods, and in particular, our 2 methods, that take into account factors do much better than the ones that don't. And the better your assumptions are about what those factors can do, the better that you can do. All right, we are done. And I will just, I sort of threw up everybody who was involved in the project. Now I will just throw up the people who are in my lab, whether or not they're involved in the project, with a couple of people who are missing because something had to be done with his dog and he was in San Diego. And I would just thank all of you for your time, and I'll happily take any questions that you have. Yeah, I mean, in a recurrent network, that's sort of the tricky bit, right? Is causality has become a snake eating its own tail, right? And I think, we all accept that with dynamical systems. Yeah, I mean, it's, in a sense, maybe that's why it's fine to say, I'm going to take a neural-centric view. I'm going to think of the spikes as real and influencing the future pattern of spikes via this factor-based abstraction. Or you can say, well, I'll take a factor-based view and think of the factors as influencing themselves through the spikes. I think both those abstractions are valid, and which one you want to use depends upon the moment, and you might even want to use both or switch back and forth. Are there other sort of valid nodes within that circular trajectory that you might want to concentrate on? Not sure. Yeah.
Because I was just thinking.
Yes.
Moment by moment.
Yeah.
Maybe change.
Yeah. Yes. So you can absolutely, for example, construct a flow field where in one region, factor 1 influences 2, but not vice versa. And then another region, factor 2 influences factor 1, but not vice versa. And that could be controlled by a third factor. Absolutely. Yes, absolutely. Yeah. You would just need some third factor to control that, right? We generally don't think that the arrows themselves are malleable, which is actually like a large part of how this framework helps us come up with hypotheses. It's like, if you can't just change the arrows whenever you want, then you need something like, oh, if I want my arrows to change, I need an extra dimension in order to make them change. Now, it's not, of course, necessarily true. A neuromodulator could change the arrows. And in fact, there's actually evidence that Ritalin increases the size of each one of those arrows just a little bit, such that everything flows a little bit faster. There's actually empirical evidence that's true from Christmas class. But generally, we think of the arrows as non-modulatable, with some important exceptions. You need to pick, but yes. Mm-hmm. 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 So there's a couple things wrapped up in there. I think I will. So first, I'll say the following, which is that if we had complete access to the brain, right, and could record every neuron and knew all the connectivity, you could fire chase them tomorrow. We do not need them anymore, right? Because you do not need to statistically estimate factors based on knowledge and understanding and cleverness. Each factor is a weighted sum of the activity of the neurons, right? And so you could just get it from, so like, for example, when we get the factors from these networks, you don't analyze the networks. The factors are real mathematically definable things, as real as anything else in your code, right? And so they're not statistically inferred. But as noted earlier, because we don't have access to the full system, we do have to statistically infer the factors. And that comes with some caveats. So for example, something that all of us worry about a lot, like constantly, like every experiment, is when you think you found factors, right? Because if you think about it, factors are just like PCs or any other method of, right? Like your axes they're going to span the space, right? But so in some sense they're very constrained, but only up to a rotation. So for example, I could have said, oh, there's two factors, one of which is mixed preparation and triggering, and the other of which is also mixed preparation and triggering, right? And it just wouldn't have been a useful way to understand the system or approach the experiment. But mathematically, it's equally valid. I mean, these things are all the same up to some rotation. So it means that we always have to be worried when we look at data, like, are you seeing a preparatory factor because like it's real, or just because you analyze the data in such a way that could make it pop out? And so, for example, the experiment where that was the biggest concern was the experiment showing the rotational patterns, right? And the original paper contains like 6 controls for that. Additional papers have come out with additional, like, John and Gamal have this very extensive method to try and ask questions like, when you see something happening in a state space, when is it a consequence of things you already know? Doesn't mean it's not real, It just means it's not additional information above and beyond the things you already knew about the data. When is it expected and when is it not? These sorts of questions consume us, but they're very domain specific. They have to do with the particular scientific question that you're asking in the moment. And so I can't give you a general answer other than, yeah, it's an issue, and it's one we all have to tackle. Yeah. I mean, it's a good question, right? So if you have to model things, should you model them at the level of the factor? Should you model them at the level of the spiking networks? Should you model them at the level of rate-based networks? Or are those just sort of neither fish nor fowl, and you should get rid of them? I don't think there's a right answer. And I think, but it raises a very interesting question, which is like, did nature choose spiking networks just because spikes are the only good way to get things a long distance? I mean, all of these things, that F is a function of us, is a function, right? So all you need is a network in there that can approximate the set of functions you care about. So in some sense, you're like, I don't care. I mean, cell types, screw them. I don't even care if it's spiking or not spiking. I don't even need inhibitory and excitatory neurons. I can just have one cell type and do everything. And sometimes that might just be perfectly okay with you. But there may also be certain function classes that are most readily approximated by certain types of neurons. And so the cell types that make up that network might be very carefully chosen in order to approximate a certain class of functions very readily, or learn to approximate a certain class of functions very readily, with a small number of neurons and not burning too much ATP. And so, are spiking networks particularly good at instantiating some functions that might be hard to instantiate in other ways? I think is a deeply interesting question, and I don't know the answer yet. Yeah. Does yeah. Or should we be looking for what? A factor. Yeah. It's a great question. So I think there's sort of two situations where you get factor neurons, right? Because that's what everybody wants, right? They want to be able to go to the neuron that's in this place or has this cell type, and they want function to parcellate such that this is the neuron that does this thing, right? That often happens in very simple circuits, right? Or in circuits that, like, for example, the monosynaptic stretch reflex. Like, well, yeah, it kind of got to break down that way, right? It will also, we see it in systems that have evolved over a very long period of time to be very good at a particular job. So for example, in motor cortex, there are no trigger neurons. There's trigger factors. They're very clear. They're very easy to find, and they're very well behaved. There are no trigger neurons, or at least, every once in a while you might find one that's dominated by that factor, but that's just random chance. But in, for example, the saccadic system, there are these omnipause neurons that just shut down in order to allow information to flow through. And so over the course of a lot of evolution, what was once a factor, right, we've now devoted neurons, for some reason that I'm not sure of, but it must be more efficient or something, we've devoted neurons to do the job of that factor. But in a network that learns something during the course of a lifetime, that's very unexpected. And so I think the short answer is factors do what you wish individual neurons did, right? It's the parcellation of function that you wish was at the level of individual neurons, like a trigger neuron and a preparatory neuron and a movement neuron. They're all mixed up at the level of individual neurons. We all know that. That's actually important for the nonlinearities in the system to do their job. But at the level of factors, that you can get what you want.
The question is, some neurons were
Yeah.
Would you expect them?
Yeah, that's a great question, and we haven't really explored it yet. I think I think as long as you had some homeostatic mechanism, right, such that all neurons could upregulate their firing rates a little bit if some neurons were lost, these networks should be highly resistant to that, to modest amounts of damage. We sort of already know that's true. Like, so for example, in David Cicillo's network that he built in order to do the reaching task, he didn't kill neurons, but what he did do is he added random perturbations to the connectivity. So you just randomly change the connectivity up to a certain amount. And the networks are incredibly robust to that, right? They will keep, you can make a very large perturbation of their connectivity, and they will keep doing their job because the perturbation of the connectivity will be in some direction that doesn't matter for the factors. However, that is only true if the factors have this property of having low tangling, right, of being well regularized. The factors have to be well behaved. They have to exhibit these big loops. If they're factors that are sort of coming close to crisscrossing, then even small amounts of noise or perturbations and the whole system will fall apart. So that's part of the reason why we think that those big circular trajectories that we just see in so many different behaviors are there. It's a way of conveying noise robustness. Thank you, guys.
Thank you very much.